Welcome to the Political Science Data Podcast. I'm Ryan, your host. This podcast helps you keep up to date with political science data and research. For this episode, we have traveled to India. Today, I am joined by a special guest, my good friend, Neerja.
Hello, Ryan. It is a pleasure to see you again. I am honored to be a guest on your podcast.
This episode highlights articles that political science data features in its coverage of the Asian politics subfield. Links to the articles and replication materials can be found on our website, policydata.com. We're going to discuss 6 recent articles that address different facets of Indian politics, including religion, gender equality, public works, monetary policy, and political participation.
Some articles take us into the past, others carry us into the future. I'm excited to discuss them with you, Ryan. Shall we get started?
Yes, indeed. Let's get cracking. Our first article is The Electoral Consequences of Mass Religious Events, India's Kumbh Mela. It was authored by Siddhartha Baral, Gareth Nellis, and Michael Weaver and published by Wiley in the American Journal of Political Science in 2025.
The central question Baral and co-authors ask is straightforward but significant. Do large-scale religious gatherings, like the Kumbh Mela, influence political outcomes? In other words, can the act of millions coming together in a religious space translate into changes in how people vote?
That's a fascinating angle. How does this connect to broader debates in political science?
It ties into research on religion and politics, especially studies on how religious identity and mobilization shape voting behavior. In Indian politics, where religion is a major cleavage, this article speaks to debates about whether cultural and ritual practices have direct electoral consequences.
So let's get into the methods. What data and research design does Baral use to answer this question?
The study is observational and relies on a clever use of geographic and electoral data. The authors look at polling stations located near the Kumbh Mela sites in Uttar Pradesh during the 2019 national elections. They combine that with detailed election results from the Election Commission of India and leverage variation in exposure to the Mela across different constituencies. The design allows them to compare voting patterns in areas more and less affected by the massive religious gathering.
And what do they find? What stands out in the results?
The main finding is that proximity to the Kumbh Mela significantly increased support for the ruling Bharatiya Janata Party, or BJP. The effect is strongest in constituencies where the Mela had the largest footprint and drew the most participants. In short, the religious event functioned as a form of mass mobilization that advantaged the incumbent party most closely associated with Hindu identity.
So who should read this article? Is it mainly for specialists, or does it speak more broadly?
I'd say both. For specialists in Indian politics, it provides rigorous evidence on a topic often discussed but rarely tested at scale. For those in comparative politics more broadly, it's a striking example of how cultural rituals intersect with democratic politics.
Our next article is titled Home Price Subsidies Increase Local Level Political Participation in Urban India. It was authored by Tanu Kumar and published by Chicago in the Journal of Politics.
The article asks whether government housing programs in India, particularly Mumbai's housing lottery, shape how poor urban residents engage with politics. Put simply, the author wants to know, when slum residents win formal housing through a lottery, does that change their political attitudes and participation?
That's a fascinating angle. How does this article fit into the broader political science literature?
It connects to debates on clientelism and welfare politics. A lot of research suggests that access to government programs can be politically mobilizing, but this study tests that idea in a very clean setting, where housing benefits are allocated randomly.
All right. Let's dig into the evidence. What kind of research design and data do the authors use?
This is an experimental study, in the sense that the housing allocation is randomized by lottery. The author surveyed both lottery winners and losers to compare their political attitudes and behaviors. Kumar also collected administrative data from Mumbai's Housing Authority to track the program and verify who received housing. By combining survey evidence with the lottery's randomization, the author can make strong causal claims.
And what do the results show? How did getting housing actually affect political engagement?
The main finding is that winning housing reduces clientelistic political behavior. Lottery winners became less reliant on local party brokers, less likely to feel they had to trade votes for services, and more willing to engage officials directly. In other words, secure housing gave them independence, which in turn shifted how they engaged with the political system.
That's really interesting. So who should read this article? Is it mostly for specialists, or a broader audience too?
It's very clearly written and should be read by anyone interested in Indian politics, urban politics, or the study of clientelism. Because the design is so strong, it's also useful for scholars of comparative politics and methods more broadly. It's a model of how to use lotteries to identify causal effects. I'd say it's both a substantive and methodological contribution, so it speaks beyond a narrow niche audience.
Let's turn to an article titled Development or Rent Seeking. How Political Influence Shapes Public Works Provision in India. It was authored by Anjali Thomas Bohlken and published by Cambridge in the British Journal of Political Science.
Thanks, Ryan. The key question in this article is, how do politicians in India use public works projects, specifically rural roads, for political gain? In plain language, it asks whether road construction is driven by developmental needs or by the political interests of those in power.
That's an important angle. How does this connect to the bigger debates in political science?
It speaks directly to debates on distributive politics and political clientelism. Scholars have long argued that public resources can be allocated for political advantage, not just efficiency or equity. This article contributes by showing how those dynamics play out in India's massive rural road program.
So what kind of data and methods does the author use to study whether politics drives road building?
This is an observational study. The author combines administrative data on road projects from India's Prime Minister's Rural Roads Program with election data at the constituency level. The dataset includes detailed information on when and where new roads were sanctioned, and it is matched with political variables like the party affiliation of legislators and electoral competitiveness. This allows the author to examine whether road placement correlates more with political advantage than with developmental need.
And what does the analysis show? What's the headline finding here?
The evidence shows that politics does shape where roads are built. Roads are more likely to be sanctioned in constituencies represented by members of the ruling party, and especially in competitive districts where incumbents face tougher re-election battles. In other words, road projects often serve as a tool for rewarding allies and shoring up political support rather than being distributed solely on developmental criteria.
So who should read this article? Is it more for a narrow specialist group, or does it speak broadly?
It's most relevant for scholars of distributive politics, clientelism, and Indian political economy. The writing is clear and the methods are transparent, so graduate students and comparativists more broadly can learn from it too. But its contribution is primarily to a specialist debate, whether infrastructure in India is allocated for development or for political rent-seeking, so it will resonate most with those interested in how politicians strategically use public goods.
Our next article is titled Cash and the Economy, Evidence from India's Demonetization. It was authored by Gabriel Chodorow-Reich, Gita Gopinath, Prachi Mishra and Abhinav Narayanan, and published by Oxford in the Quarterly Journal of Economics.
This article asks a direct question: how independent is India's monetary policy? And to what extent is it shaped by political pressures rather than purely economic considerations? Put simply, The authors want to know whether central bank decisions in India are made with an eye to elections and political cycles.
And how does this connect with the broader debates in political science and economics?
It builds on long-standing debates about central bank independence. In comparative politics and political economy, one key question has always been, do governments let technocrats manage monetary policy, or do they intervene for short-term political gain? This article brings new evidence from India to a literature often focused on advanced economies.
What about their research design? How do they actually test this question?
The study is observational. The authors analyze time series data on monetary policy decisions, especially changes in interest rates, alongside macroeconomic indicators like inflation and growth. They then compare those patterns to the timing of India's electoral cycles. The evidence comes from Reserve Bank of India decisions spanning several decades, combined with official economic statistics.
So what do they find? Are interest rates really influenced by politics in India?
The findings suggest that politics does matter. Monetary policy in India has not been fully insulated from electoral cycles. The authors show that in the run-up to elections, governments exerted pressure to keep interest rates lower, even when inflation suggested tightening. After elections, the central bank often returned to more orthodox policies. So the evidence points to a partial, but not complete, lack of independence.
That's fascinating. So who should be reading this article?
I'd recommend it to anyone interested in Indian political economy, but also to those studying central bank independence more broadly. For Indian politics research, it's a meaningful contribution because it shows how macroeconomic management and electoral politics are tightly intertwined.
Our next article is titled Does Affirmative Action Work? Evaluating India's Quota System. It was authored by Alexander Lee and published by Sage in Comparative Political Studies.
The central question here is very direct. Has India's system of reserved quotas for disadvantaged groups actually achieved its intended goals? In plain terms, the authors ask whether affirmative action through quotas has improved representation, access to opportunities, and long-term equality.
And how does this fit into the bigger scholarly debates?
It speaks to both the global literature on affirmative action and the India-specific debates on caste and inequality. India has the world's most extensive quota system, so studying it gives us insights into whether affirmative action can reduce entrenched inequalities in deeply stratified societies.
What kind of research design and data does the author rely on to assess this question?
This is a review article, so instead of presenting new data, the author synthesized findings from decades of empirical work on India's quota system. He pulls together studies of electoral outcomes, education, public employment, and social attitudes, and evaluates the methodological approaches those studies used, ranging from natural experiments to survey-based and observational evidence. The goal is to provide a systematic assessment of the evidence we already have.
So when we look across all that evidence, what's the bottom line? What do we find?
The key finding is that quotas have succeeded in improving descriptive representation. More members of disadvantaged groups now hold office and public sector jobs. But the effects on broader socio-economic outcomes are more limited. Quotas haven't eliminated caste disparities, and in many areas progress has been slower than hoped. Still, the system has reduced the most extreme forms of exclusion and given marginalized communities an institutionalized political voice.
And finally, who should read this article? Is it narrowly academic or more broadly useful?
It's especially valuable for scholars and students of Indian politics, but also for anyone interested in affirmative action globally. For policymakers and educators, it's a concise, evidence-based overview of what India's quota system has accomplished and what challenges remain.
Let's turn to our last featured article, titled Local Order, Policing, and Bribes, Evidence from India. It was authored by Juan Tellez, Erik Wibbels and Anirudh Krishna, and published by Cambridge in World Politics.
Thanks, Ryan. This article asks a straightforward but important question. Does improving local policing institutions in India actually increase public trust and strengthen perceptions of state legitimacy? In plain terms, the authors want to know whether reforms in day-to-day law enforcement change how citizens view government authority.
How does this article connect to the broader political science literature?
It fits into long-standing debates about state capacity and governance. A big theme in the literature is that everyday interactions with local officials, like police, can either build or erode trust in democratic institutions.
All right, let's talk methods. What's the research design here, and what kind of data are they working with?
The study uses a field experiment in India, working directly with local police departments. The authors introduced reforms such as community outreach programs and procedural training for officers, then measured the impact on public trust. They relied on original survey data collected from residents before and after the interventions, so the evidence is grounded in experimental comparisons rather than just correlations.
And what do they find? Did the reforms actually change public attitudes?
Yes, but with nuance. The study shows that even modest reforms in how police interact with citizens, like more transparent procedures or community meetings, can raise public trust. However, the effects are uneven across social groups, and deep-seated perceptions of bias and corruption limit how far trust can be rebuilt. The bottom line is that reform helps, but it's not a quick fix.
That's really interesting. So who should read this article, and why?
I'd recommend it to scholars and practitioners alike. For political scientists, it's a clear, well-executed experiment that adds to the literature on state capacity in developing democracies. For policymakers and police reform advocates, it's valuable because it shows concrete ways that everyday policing practices shape public trust. It's not just a narrow technical piece. The writing is accessible, and the implications reach beyond India to other contexts where local enforcement is the front line of state authority.
When you look across these 6 studies on 6 different facets of the politics of India, what do they collectively tell us about how democracy actually works in India, not just as an abstract ideal but as a lived, data-driven reality? And how should political scientists rethink their theories of democracy based on this evidence?
Taken together, these articles show that Indian democracy is not just a grand slogan, it is constantly being negotiated and reshaped in everyday life. Mass religious gatherings remind us that culture and belief can directly mobilize voters. Housing lotteries and road projects demonstrate how material distribution, whether by chance or by policy, shapes citizen trust and participation. Monetary policy highlights the reach of central institutions into daily livelihoods. Quotas reveal both the promise and the limits of formal equality, while policing shows how the local state mediates power and security. For political scientists, the lesson is that democracy in India is deeply multi-layered. It is lived through religion, infrastructure, welfare, finance, representation, and law enforcement all at once. Theories of democracy that focus only on elections or institutions miss the way governance seeps into people's lives through these channels. India teaches us that democracy is not one thing, but a mosaic of practices, negotiations, and power struggles, and that makes it both incredibly resilient and deeply contested.
What would longtime scholars of Indian politics find most surprising here?
The surprise is just how much micro-level interventions and everyday experiences are driving political outcomes. Scholars often focus on national parties, ideology, or constitutional rules. But the research shows that a single religious festival can shift electoral behavior, a housing lottery can transform political trust, and the quality of local policing can redefine how citizens see the state. For veteran observers, it's striking how these small, grounded experiences accumulate into large-scale political consequences.
Now, if we step outside the academy, what's the main takeaway for policymakers, NGOs, or even businesses working in India?
The big takeaway is that the success of policy in India depends on local implementation and citizen perception. Roads, for example, create opportunities only when they connect people to markets in ways they can actually use. Monetary policy outcomes hinge on how ordinary households respond, not just on central bank models. Quotas, housing schemes, and community policing reshape political trust and social cohesion. For anyone engaging with India, whether drafting policy, running an NGO, or investing, the lesson is to pay close attention to the lived experience of ordinary people, not just the policy design on paper.
That's a perfect note to end on. Neerja, thank you so much for your insights and allowing me to visit you today.
You're welcome, Ryan. And thank you for visiting me and giving me the opportunity to talk about research on the politics of India with you.
And of course, we thank you, dear listener, for joining us on the Political Science Data podcast.